The match between DNA from the bones and from living Romanov descendants appears to prove that the bones are the true remains of the Romanovs.
For nearly a century, the fate of the Romanovs, Russia's last royal family, was buried beneath layers of silence, rumor, and cover-ups. Then came the evidence, bones, letters, and forgotten documents that finally began to speak. When modern DNA analysis entered the story, the truth that emerged was nothing like what the world expected.
DNA can't tell us exactly which child is Anastasia and which child is Maria. The evidence is overwhelming.
Yeah, absolutely. That's their son.
Exactly.
And they had one son.
This wasn't just a royal tragedy uncovered. It was the rewriting of an empire's darkest ending. The murder that ended an empire. In July of 1918, as the Russian Civil War tore the country apart, the air in Yekaterinburg hung heavy and restless. Everyone in the city felt it. Soldiers on the corners, families peeking through curtains, whispers about who was winning the war that week. And inside one ordinary-looking merchant's house, painted white and quiet, history was waiting to end. Locals called it the Ipatiev House. The Bolsheviks called it the House of Special Purpose. That name alone told you something dark was brewing inside. Behind its sealed windows, the Romanov family, once the rulers of an empire, were living their final days like ghosts in their own country.
They had kept their spirits relatively high, that they were either going to be sort of secretly sent abroad.
Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, his wife Alexandra, their 4 daughters, and their frail 13-year-old son Alexei had been prisoners here for weeks. They weren't treated cruelly, but there was no illusion of freedom. Soldiers watched their every move. Even the windows were painted over, so no one could look in or out. In their months of captivity, the Romanovs still tried to live like a family. Nicholas chopped firewood in the yard for exercise. Alexandra read aloud from prayer books. The girls sewed, sang hymns, and took care of their younger brother. Their doctor, Botkin, wrote letters he knew might never leave the house, just to stay sane. In the city, a man named Yakov Yurovsky, a cold, disciplined officer of the secret police, the Cheka, was now in charge of guarding them. He had a job to do, and orders from higher up were becoming clearer by the hour.
Unnerved by Yurovsky, and that he sort of had the measure of an evil man.
The Czechoslovak Legion, a foreign force fighting its way across Russia, was pushing closer to Yekaterinburg. If they reached the city, they could free the royal family and turn them into a powerful symbol against the revolution. To the Bolsheviks in charge, that risk was unacceptable. Better a dead symbol than a living one. On the night of July 16th, just past 11, Yurovsky told the family doctor, Eugene Botkin, to wake everyone. He said it was a precaution, that there might be fighting nearby.
There's a fight for the city. We need to move you all for your own safety.
And the family needed to move downstairs for safety. They believed him. Why wouldn't they? They'd been through scares before. Nicholas helped his son Alexei dress. The boy could barely stand. His hemophilia made every movement risky. Alexandra, exhausted and sick herself, leaned on her husband's arm. The 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, gathered small personal items: a pillow, a prayer book, and a locket. 2 chairs were carried down for Alexandra and Alexei, since the boy couldn't stand long. The rest stood behind them in a small, plain room on the ground floor, a semi-basement with low plaster walls, no windows, and no way out once the double doors shut. 4 servants stayed with them, even though they'd been offered the chance to leave. Dr. Botkin, the maid Anna Demidova, the cook Ivan Karitonov, and the footman Alexei Trupp. None wanted to abandon the family. They waited, half asleep, thinking they'd soon be moved again. When Yurovsky returned, he wasn't alone. Several armed men filed into the room behind him. The family stood, confused. Nicholas asked what was going on. Yurovsky unfolded a paper and read from it in a steady voice. It said the Ural Soviet had decided to execute Nicholas Romanov.
Nikolai Alexandrovich, Alexandra Fedorovna, the Ural Regional Soviet Committee has sentenced you to death.
He barely finished the sentence before the guns came up. The room exploded in sound. Pistol fire in a concrete box. It's deafening. Smoke, shouts, confusion.
This sort of fusillade rings out in this tiny little room, and several bullets hit him in the chest.
The first volley hit several people, but not all. Some bullets ricocheted off the walls, some struck the floor. Others hit, but didn't kill. And then came a strange moment. The shooters realized some of the bullets weren't working. The daughters, standing together, weren't falling. The men fired again. Still, the girls didn't drop. Only later did they discover why. Hidden beneath their dresses, sewn into the lining of their corsets, were diamonds and jewels, their last attempt at survival, meant to buy passage if they were ever sent into exile. The gems acted like armor, deflecting bullets.
They were essentially wearing the world's most expensive bulletproof vest.
It didn't save them, but it made death slower, messier, crueler. Within minutes, the basement fell silent again. 11 people lay motionless on the floor. Among the executioners were Grigory Nikulin, Mikhail Medvedev, and Pyotr Ermakov, men hardened by months of war. Later, Yurovsky would write a short report about that night. Reading it today feels like reading instructions for a machine. The killing was done. Now came the part he found harder, making 11 bodies disappear. A truck waited outside. The plan had been prepared earlier. The bodies were to be taken out of the city under the cover of darkness, buried in an old mine shaft north of Yekaterinburg called Ganina Yama. The crew even had a password, chimney sweep, for those helping along the route. The men wrapped the bodies in sheets, carried them upstairs, and loaded them into the truck. It rumbled out of town past midnight, its engine struggling in the mud. When they reached the mine, they realized it wasn't as deep as they'd hoped. Lanterns flickered from distant cottages. Villagers were awake. The spot wasn't safe. Still, they tried. They stripped the corpses of clothing to hide identities, poured sulfuric acid on the skin, threw in hand grenades to collapse the pit, and set fires using gasoline. But a shallow pit and wet wood don't burn cleanly. The flames sputtered. Smoke hung low in the trees. The smell carried. The clock was ticking. The truck bogged down in the mud as they tried to leave. They hacked at branches to free it, panic rising with every wasted minute. Time was running out. The Czechoslovak Legion was getting closer to the city. Every minute the Bolsheviks spent in the forest increased the chance of being discovered. So Yurovsky changed plans. Forget the mine. Find new ground. A few miles away, near the old Koptyaki Road, they stopped in a patch of thick forest. It was the kind of place no one would stumble into by accident.
And eventually Yurovsky, completely exhausted, just capitulated and said, right, that's it. We just dump them here.
The men dug through the night, shoveling wet earth by lantern light. They poured more acid, more gasoline, more fire. Then they covered the ground with dirt, branches, and brush. From a few steps away, it looked like any other patch of forest floor. At sunrise, Yurovsky gathered his men, reminded them that silence was survival, and ordered them home. By morning, Yekaterinburg looked ordinary again. The truck tracks were fading in the mud. The air smelled faintly of smoke, but the city was quiet. The only official statement released said that Nicholas Romanov has been executed. Nothing more. No mention of Alexandra, the children, or the servants. The rest of the family had simply been erased. The Bolsheviks locked the house and told the guards to keep silent. The white-painted windows stayed closed. For decades, the building itself would stand as a rumor, until the Soviets finally demolished it. Not to preserve history, but to erase it. But you can't erase whispers. Villagers near Ganina Yama started talking. They'd seen a truck at strange hours. They'd smelled burning flesh. Some had found scraps of fabric and bones near the old mine. The forest was giving up pieces of the truth. A few weeks later, anti-Bolshevik forces, known as the White Army, captured Yekaterinburg. They sent an investigator named Nikolai Sokolov to find out what really happened. Sokolov worked with almost nothing. The killers had left chaos behind. Fires, acid, half-burned ground. But he searched tirelessly. He collected spent bullets, charred bone fragments, buttons, and shreds of clothing. He interviewed anyone who'd seen or smelled anything that night. He became convinced the bodies had been destroyed at the mine. He wasn't entirely wrong. He just didn't know about the second grave in the forest. His findings, written under impossible conditions, became one of the earliest modern forensic investigations. He photographed everything, kept samples, and wrote a detailed report before fleeing Russia when the Red Army advanced again. But history doesn't stay buried forever. And decades later, a quiet patch of forest started whispering its secrets. Unearthing the Romanovs' lost grave. The grave wasn't found by chance. It was found because two men refused to let history stay buried. In the late 1970s, long before Russia was ready to talk about the Romanovs, a geologist from Sverdlovsk named Alexander Avdonin and a Moscow filmmaker, Gely Ryabov, decided they couldn't ignore a piece of paper they had come across. It was a first-hand account from the killer himself, Yakov Yurovsky, describing in cold, methodical detail what happened to the bodies after the night in the cellar. His words were like coordinates, hidden in plain sight, and the two men followed them the way a treasure hunter follows a weathered map. The letter pointed them to the north of Yekaterinburg, toward the same forest road the Bolsheviks had taken in the early hours of July 17, 1918. The place had a name that would sound almost innocent later, Porosenkov Log, or Piglet's Ravine. By the summer of 1979, Avdonin and Ryabov finally decided to test their theory. They carried no official permits, no television cameras, no publicity, just shovels, a camera, and nerves of steel.
We came at 10 o'clock and started work and discovered the wooden rails. It seems like this was the right place.
It was the Soviet Union at the height of its silence, a place where digging into royal graves could ruin your life or end it. Still, they went. They dug only enough to be sure. A few hours in, the earth gave up its secret. Bones, teeth, skulls, the remains of people who clearly hadn't died in peace. They took photographs, careful and quiet, then filled the pit again, tamped it down, and covered their tracks like nothing had ever happened. Only they and the forest knew what lay beneath. For 10 years, they kept that secret. Not because they wanted to, because they had to. Speaking it aloud in Brezhnev's Russia would have been suicide. The story of the Romanovs was still an open wound the government wanted buried deeper than any grave. So they waited.
Much of the respect and much of the love for Nicholas II.
And that was the spark, really, that lit the Russian Revolution.
A decade later, the wind began to change. Glasnost, the late 1980s wave of political openness, started prying open old archives and lifting the lid on topics that had been forbidden for generations. People were finally beginning to say the things everyone had whispered in private. It was only then that Avdonin came forward. In July 1991, as the Soviet Union itself was beginning to crack apart, local officials in Sverdlovsk gave their quiet approval to dig again. Avdonin pointed them to the exact spot he and Ryabov had found 12 years earlier. The forest that had kept its secret for 73 years was about to speak. 9 skeletons emerged from the soil of Porosenkov Log over several days of careful digging. Not 11, 9. That number said everything. The killers had buried 11 people that night in 1918. Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, and 4 loyal attendants. 2 were missing. The discovery proved the rumors true. The Romanovs hadn't vanished into legend. They were right here, hidden beneath a shallow rise of pine and birch.
A Russian archaeologist makes, frankly, the discovery of a lifetime. He discovers the exact spot where the Romanovs are buried.
But even in death, their family was still incomplete. Even after 70 years, the bones still showed traces of acid and burns from the panicked attempts to destroy them. From the very first hours, investigators could tell what kind of group they were dealing with. The skeletons fit together like a broken family portrait. Taller adult bones, smaller female frames, and the size difference between parents, daughters, and servants was clear even before the lab work began. It was obvious that this wasn't a random burial. It was a household. The early forensic checks, bone structure, dental shape, pelvis width, pointed toward a father, a mother, 3 daughters, and 4 unrelated adults. But that still left 2 children missing. The question became an obsession. Which daughter was gone? Was it Maria, the 3rd born, or Anastasia, the youngest and most famous, because of the legends that would follow her? Every expert had an opinion, but opinions weren't enough anymore. The world wanted proof. That's when science stepped in and changed everything.
The scientists say it's nearly 100% certain that these are indeed the bones of the last Tsar and his family.
In the early 1990s, a new tool was entering the spotlight: DNA testing. Not the full genome sequencing we know today, but something powerful enough to link past and present. The method they used relied on something tiny inside our cells called mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA. Here's the simple version. Most of our DNA sits inside the nucleus, half from your mother, half from your father. But there's a small separate set of DNA that lives inside tiny power units of the cell called mitochondria. And that part comes only from your mother. It's passed down almost unchanged through generations, like a family signature written in microscopic ink. That was the breakthrough. The Empress, Alexandra Feodorovna, had been born a German princess and was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria of Britain. That meant her maternal DNA line still existed in living descendants. One of them was Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, Queen Elizabeth II's husband. Scientists reached out to him, explained what they were doing, and he agreed to help. When they compared his mitochondrial DNA to samples taken from the female skeletons in the grave, the match was exact where it mattered most. The sequences lined up perfectly, confirming that the Empress and 3 of her daughters were indeed among the remains. But science didn't stop there. The supposed Tsar, Nicholas II, needed his own proof. And what the scientists found was something rare, almost poetic.
To be part of a team that might have been those of Tsar Nicholas, Alexandra, and the Romanov family.
In its strangeness, inside his mitochondrial DNA, they noticed something odd: heteroplasmy, a condition where a person carries 2 slightly different versions of mitochondrial DNA at the same point. Think of it like having 2 spellings of the same word coexisting inside you. It's incredibly rare, but not impossible. Skeptics jumped on it, claiming it was contamination or an error. But then, researchers got their hands on a sample from the Tsar's own brother, Grand Duke George Alexandrovich, preserved from a royal burial years earlier. And guess what? He had the same unusual 2-variant pattern in the same exact place. That one detail sealed the case. The weirdness wasn't a mistake. It was a genetic fingerprint passed down through their mother's side, shared by both brothers. It proved beyond reasonable doubt that the man in the grave was Nicholas II himself. And then came a bonus layer of proof: an old blood-stained shirt worn by Nicholas II. In 1891, decades before his death, the Tsar had been attacked in Japan, and the shirt he wore that day had been preserved in a museum. Scientists took a swab from that century-old fabric and tested it. The DNA from that blood matched the DNA extracted from his bones and tooth exactly. A living signature reaching across time, confirming once and for all that the main male remains were truly the Tsar. At the same time, scientists checked regular DNA markers from the cell nucleus, the kind you inherit half from each parent, to make sure the family relationships made sense. Everything fit perfectly. A father, a mother, their daughters, and 4 unrelated adults. By the mid-90s, the picture was clear. The main Romanov family had been found, but 2 children, Alexei and one of his sisters, were still missing, and that mystery refused to die. The gap between the 9 bodies and the 11 people known to have died that night gave fuel to a whole new wave of myths. Some people clung to hope that one of the Romanov children had somehow escaped the massacre.
Okay, let's go.
Books and movies claimed Anastasia had survived and fled west under a new name. The legend of Anastasia became one of the most famous survival stories in the world, retold again and again because the facts still had holes big enough for dreams to slip through. Meanwhile, teams kept searching. In the 1990s, groups of scientists, archaeologists, and local volunteers combed the forest again and again, sometimes officially, sometimes quietly, probing the ground near Porosenkov Log and Ganina Yama. They used metal detectors, old maps, and Yurovsky's notes to guide them. Each dig brought new fragments, nails, bits of clothing, cartridge shells, but no second grave. Finding them would take another decade, another shift in history, and another quiet team who refused to let the trail fade.
Scientists were ultimately able to identify the remains of the Tsar, his wife Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters.
The breakthrough that ended the mystery. It didn't take an army or $1 million dig to change history. The break came from a few locals with shovels, curiosity, and a hunch about where the killers might have turned off the dirt track that night in 1918. It was the summer of 2007, almost 90 years after the Romanovs vanished. The forest north of Yekaterinburg was thick with mosquitoes and summer heat when a small search team started probing the ground roughly 230 feet from the first burial site. The spot didn't look special, just a shallow rise covered in pine needles and roots.
Ground-penetrating radar, electromagnetics, anything that they could do to look under the ground.
But when they dug in, the soil shifted to reveal something dark and brittle beneath. What they lifted out wasn't a complete skeleton. It was fragments, 44 pieces in all, some no bigger than coins, blackened by fire and broken by time. A few were unmistakable bits of skull, others tiny shards of ribs or limbs. Among them, the searchers found teeth, molars with traces of silver fillings, an expensive touch almost no one in revolutionary Russia could afford. Those small flashes of silver said something that words didn't need to. Whoever these people were, they had money. The field team didn't rush or boast. They called the authorities and logged everything properly. Then experts came in to secure the site, mapping, photographing, and sifting every inch of the dirt around the fragments. By the time the last bag was sealed, the outlines were clear. The bones came from 2 people, a teenage girl and a younger boy just entering his teens. From the beginning, everyone knew this wouldn't be a normal investigation. The remains were tiny, burned and soaked decades ago in acid. Most forensic tests need solid, clean bone to pull DNA from. These were scraps, but there was too much at stake to give up. Russia reached out to 2 of the world's best labs at working with damaged samples, people who could coax a story out of dust. One was the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory in Maryland, known as AFDIL. The other was the Institute for Legal Medicine in Innsbruck, Austria, a place famous for extracting DNA from centuries-old bones. The job they took on sounded simple when written on paper. Find enough surviving DNA to prove that these 2 individuals were the missing children of the Tsar and Tsarina.
So they could say, well, I shot Nicholas. So he died immediately, but the others suffered horribly, particularly the children.
Then go one step further. Show that the boy was the heir, Alexei himself. The challenge was brutal. Fire destroys most nuclear DNA, and acid eats away what's left. So the scientists started with the kind of DNA that hides deeper, tucked inside the cell's tiny powerhouses, the mitochondria, mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA. Because each cell carries thousands of copies, it usually survives when everything else doesn't. Working under sterile conditions, the teams ground minute pieces of bone into powder and carefully dissolved the mineral crust around the surviving cells. What little DNA remained was copied again and again using a method called amplification, like turning up the volume on a whisper until it became loud enough to read. They weren't looking for names hidden in code. They were looking for matches, specific patterns already known from the Empress Alexandra and her daughters, whose DNA had been analyzed in the early 1990s from the first grave. And there it was. The same rare genetic markers appeared again in these new samples, an unmistakable maternal signature that linked the remains directly to Alexandra's bloodline, the one that traced back to Queen Victoria of Britain. It was the first solid proof that the girl and the boy came from the same mother as the family found earlier. That alone was a breakthrough, but the scientists needed more than a maternal link. They needed to map both parents into the equation. For that, they turned to nuclear DNA, the kind that carries the blended inheritance of mother and father. They focused on what are called STRS, short repeating sections scattered across the genome. When the labs compared the STR profiles from the two new remains against those from Nicholas and Alexandra,
the only one of them, the family really, who had a quick death was actually Nicholas.
The numbers fell perfectly into place. Every marker from the boy and girl could be explained by the parental profiles already documented from the main grave. But for the boy, there was one more test that mattered above all: the Y chromosome. That thin strip of DNA passes almost unchanged from father to son, generation to generation, marking a direct male line. From one of the boy's femur fragments, the team built a detailed YSTR profile, 17 markers long, and compared it to two others, one from the Tsar's own remains and another from a living male line relative of the dynasty, Prince Andrew Andreevich Romanov. The result was stunning. All three matched, marker for marker, across the board. The pattern was so specific that when the labs searched global databases with thousands of YSTR entries, not a single unrelated match turned up. The odds of finding that exact same sequence by chance were astronomically low. The line from father to son to cousin ran perfectly straight. There was no room for coincidence.
Dr. Gill must compare the DNA pulled from the skeletons with those of known members of the Romanov family.
The boy was Alexei Nikolaevich Romanov, the lost heir to the Russian throne. Still, the scientists didn't rush to announce it. Old bones can easily pick up modern DNA from handlers, and mistakes can happen even in world-class labs. So both teams decided to split key samples and run them independently in completely separate rooms. Different staff, different machines, different air systems. Every surface was bleached. Equipment was blasted with ultraviolet light. Gloves, masks, and suits were changed between each step. Even Russian government observers stood behind glass to watch, ensuring nothing was tampered with. When both labs finished, they compared notes. Every result matched. Then a third scientist, independent from both groups, reviewed the raw data and confirmed that the sequences lined up perfectly. It was the gold standard of verification, the kind of double-checked, triple-sealed work that leaves no space for doubt. By the time the numbers were run through statistical models, the strength of the evidence was overwhelming. The DNA results weren't just likely. They were mathematically near impossible to contradict. The likelihood ratios, a way scientists measure how much stronger one explanation is than another, reached into the trillions. In plain English, that means the data were trillions of times more likely if these were the Romanov children than if they were two random, unrelated people. Everything lined up: the ages, the chemistry, the math. The girl's remains matched someone 15 to 19 years old, while the boy's bones belonged to a child between 12 and 15. That fit precisely with Maria and Alexei, the two youngest members of the family, lost in that second grave. What happened next would no longer belong to scientists in lab coats. It would belong to Russia itself, its leaders, its church, and its people. Because now that DNA had spoken, the question wasn't whether the Romanovs were found. It was what the country would do with the truth. The faith, the fallout, and the final farewell. Russia didn't just get an answer, it got a reckoning. Once the DNA work confirmed exactly who was who, the legends that had lived for nearly a century began to crumble. The biggest one fell first, the myth that maybe one of the children had escaped that basement in 1918. The truth was colder and final. No one got out. Every child of Nicholas and Alexandra died that night, and with that, all the survivor stories began to die their slow deaths. For decades, the most famous of them all was Anna Anderson, a woman who claimed to be the youngest Romanov daughter, Anastasia. Her tale had fueled books, movies, and hope. The idea that maybe one of the Tsar's children had lived through the gunfire and chaos.
Anna Anderson's contentious claim that she was the Tsar's youngest daughter, Anastasia.
But in the 1990s, scientists got access to a sample from Anderson's preserved medical tissue and ran the same test that had identified the Empress's maternal line, the one that also linked to Prince Philip. The verdict was clear. The DNA didn't match. Anderson wasn't a Romanov. Separate tests tied her to a missing Polish factory worker named Franziska Szankowska. Once the science stopped wobbling, Russia had to decide what to do with the truth it had uncovered. In July 1988, exactly 80 years after the execution, the state held a funeral in St. Petersburg. The coffins of the 9 identified Romanovs and their loyal attendants were carried into the Peter and Paul Cathedral, the resting place of earlier emperors. It was formal, solemn, and heavy with meaning. For the first time since the revolution, the Russian government publicly acknowledged what had happened and laid the family to rest beside their ancestors. Not everyone agreed on how to feel about it. Some saw it as justice delayed. Others felt it was an attempt to tidy up a tragedy. But the burial marked a turning point, a line in the sand that said, "This is our past, and we will own it." 2 years later, the Russian Orthodox Church took its own step. In 2000, the church canonized Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children as passion bearers, not for their wealth or power, but for the way they met suffering without vengeance. That decision changed how millions of Russians talked about the Romanovs. They weren't just an overthrown royal family anymore. They became symbols of endurance and faith. You can feel that transformation in the city of Yekaterinburg, where a massive church now stands on the site of the house where they died, the Church on the Blood. Every July, crowds gather there for all-night services, lighting candles and singing prayers that rise over the spot where the cellar once stood. A few miles away, in the woods at Ganina Yama, another sacred site took shape, a monastery complex built around the place where the killers first tried to hide the bodies. 7 small chapels now ring the clearing, one for each family member. The story feels complete when you stand there, but it isn't. In 2015, the church asked for the case to be reopened. It wasn't because the DNA was in question, it was because faith wanted its own certainty. Investigators exhumed the remains of Alexander III, the Tsar's father, to confirm that the Y chromosome line between father and son matched. It did. More comparisons followed, testing against living Romanov relatives. The results came back again in 2018, identical, consistent, unshakable. By 2020, even senior Russian investigators repeated the same conclusion. The identifications were authentic beyond doubt. And here's the part most people don't know. 2 coffins are still waiting. The remains of Alexei and Maria, confirmed by DNA as the last missing children, have not been buried with their parents and sisters.
The task of identifying the skeletons falls to Russian forensic anthropologist Sergei Abramov.
During the renewed investigation, they were moved into the care of the church and placed at the Novospassky Monastery in Moscow. As of the latest public word, they remain there, unburied, resting quietly under watch, while church leaders decide how to unite them with the rest of the family. The old logging track where the two graves were found has also become a sacred space. Once just a patch of mud and birch, it's now protected by law, marked with crosses and small shrines. People come quietly, leave flowers, and whisper prayers into the trees. It's not a grand cathedral, it's the opposite, the kind of ordinary place where truth hides until someone insists on finding it. In the end, the Romanov case didn't just solve a mystery, it changed the playbook for how we find the past. The same blend of mitochondrial DNA, nuclear testing, and family tracing that cracked this century-old puzzle is now used worldwide, from identifying lost soldiers to solving royal mysteries like King Richard III, whose bones were found under a parking lot in England. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.